I'm Bill Auten of Auten Claims Management.
I'm Chantal Roberts of CMR Consulting, and welcome to the Art of Adjusting podcast.
Today, we're going to talk about life as an insurance adjuster from the perspective of property, auto, liability, or workers' compensation adjusters. Our goal is to bring interesting topics in the world of claims adjusting to people who are working as an adjuster now and to people who are considering a career as a claims adjuster. Hey, Chantal, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm getting over a cold. How are you?
A lot of that going around, I hear.
Yeah,
Well,
really.
I'm doing pretty well. And today we've got a special guest with us, Marty Shaw. He is one of the top tree experts in the United States. He was the first Academy registered member of the American Society of Consulting Arborists in Tennessee. And he's also an internationally recognized author of independently published subject matter books and has nearly 3 decades of consulting experience. Marty is credentialed in horticulture, arboriculture, nursery production, real estate, insurance, and has been an FAA pilot since 2016. Welcome, Marty Shaw. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing great, Bill. I appreciate the invite and really looking forward to talking to you guys today. Thanks
Yeah,
for.
we have some interesting questions to get answered by you. And you and I have worked in the past on at least a project, and I can attest to your skill sets. So why don't you tell us what is a tree expert and how did you become one?
Well, I first got involved in arboriculture back in the late 1990s, and I was working for a lawn care company, and they decided that they wanted to open up a tree and shrub division, and so during the course of my study to become the tree and shrub manager. I studied under a guy named Dr. Larry Waddell, who was a Scots guy and was a horticulturist. And one day we were out working together, and he showed me this form. He asked me if I'd be interested in doing some pruning. And I said, sure. And then at the bottom of this form, there was a little indicia. And I said, Dr. Waddell, what's that? And he says, oh, that's ISA certified arborist. You should do that. I said, oh, okay. So I didn't know anything about becoming an ISA certified arborist, but I got the form and I sent that in and decided that I was going to become a certified arborist. And so to become a certified arborist, you have to study for a couple of years and then you have to take an exam. And if you pass the exam, then they give you the credential. And it's got about 20 different domains, uh, everything from biology to how to fell a tree and a lot of stuff in between. And so Fred Dr. Waddell suggested I do it. I signed up there was a class they were giving, and I'll never forget as I sat down for the class, the instructor said to everybody, all right, I'd like you to get your ISA certification manual out and turn to page 4. And I'm looking around and everybody's turned to page 4. Uh, I said, there's a manual. And
Wow.
so the instructor said, all right, everybody, we're going to take a break for a few minutes and I want to talk to you. And so uh, he pulled me aside and he said, look, most people study this thing for a couple of years before they take the exam. And it just so happens I have an extra copy. You can follow along today, but I recommend that you reschedule your exam for a later date. And I said, well, why don't I just study it for today and then I can let you know at the end of the day if I'm going to take the exam tomorrow. And he said, that's fine. And so I studied along with the rest of the class and was able to keep up pretty well. Dr. Waddell had done a very nice job of training me and ended up studying the book and took it home that night and read the entire thing, studied all the questions at the end of each chapter. And the next day I took the exam and passed with flying colors. So that's how I became a certified arborist. And I guess that makes me a tree expert, but there's different levels of tree expertise. And I went well beyond just the ISA certification. So I'm now a board certified master arborist and a registered consulting arborist as well.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Well, you're more than just a tree expert. You're a cramming expert too, I guess.
A what expert?
Cram.
You cram.
Well,
You cram a
uh,
lot. I am just enthralled because I can pretty much only identify the pine tree and not like the particular pine tree, but I think just the one pine tree that's the official state pine tree of Arkansas, and then I think a maple or an oak, and that's pretty much it. So you can probably like run rings around me, and that's a tree pun. Ha!
Yeah.
Because we like dad jokes around here at the Art of Adjusting podcast.
My father-in-law is very good at identifying trees just from the bark, and we'll walk through the woods together, and he'll point stuff out. There's a sugar maple, there's a basswood, and I'm trying to compare and trying to learn from the bark, and I'm getting a little better at it, but not like him. He's pretty much spot on.
Well, it depends on when you do your taxonomy course. I did all mine in the wintertime, and so I had to study the bark and learn how to identify trees based on the bark.
Well, let's talk a little bit about liability because we work in the world of insurance here, and we talk a lot about liability claims and what happens when someone is negligent and causes injuries or damage to somebody else. So, for property owners, what are the key factors that they should be considering when they have trees on their property and they want to avoid problems with those trees causing injury or damage to somebody else?
So that's a really good question. And it's one that is filled with mystery until you are faced with a liability, and then everything becomes well known. But tree owners basically have a duty to periodically inspect their trees, and they have to identify anything tree-wise that looks dangerous. And so then the next question becomes, well, what looks dangerous? Well, on the most granular level, things that look dangerous would be like dead trees and dead branches. But there are other defects that trees have that can look dangerous. And whenever you see something that looks dangerous, you have to either get it checked out by an expert or remove the danger. We call that mitigation. Um, so if they find a tree that looks dangerous, they have a duty to mitigate that danger within a reasonable period of time. And then a failure to act reasonably within a reasonable period of time may result in a breach of that duty. And then the tree owner can be found liable for damages or injuries that result from a dangerous tree. So a cogent tree risk management policy is going to have owners that have large numbers of trees in proximity to people, like a golf course or a theme park or a campground or other facilities. It just protects the owner of those trees from liability. If you can prove that you did your diligence and that you fulfilled your duty of care, then you're not going to be exposed to as great a liability. It doesn't prevent you from being sued, but when it comes down to it, there are acts of God and there are things that are preventable. And if you've done what you could to prevent injuries and damage, then you've done your duty.
So, Marty, I have a question. How would you define a dangerous tree? We were talking before we got on the air, so to speak, that I'm going to be pruning up a couple of my trees, and I have a tree that I know is dying simply because half of the tree has leaves on it in the summer, and then half of it doesn't. So I'm fairly certain that thing is dying on the inside. But if it were all, fully have the leaves on it, how would we know that there was a disease going on the interior, or that this may be a dangerous tree? How would we know this?
Well, you can't always detect a dangerous tree because trees don't always tell us that they're dangerous. A cogent tree risk management policy involves training the stakeholders about the risk associated with having trees near people. And then on the most granular level, it's looking for dead limbs and dead trees. And if they exist near where they can fall on people or cause injury or damage, then you do have an obligation to mitigate that potential. And you have an obligation to do it within a pretty reasonable period of time. The court has to decide what all those things mean as far as there's no set time limit. There's just kind of these rough gray area guidelines that we go by. But there are other common high risk defects that can be taught and staff can be trained to look for these things like decay and cracks and weak attachments and heaving leans, widowmakers, bulges, weak roots and seams, and there's a bunch of other ones. It's not a hugely time consuming, but it's certainly cheaper to train staff and to mitigate this stuff than it is to allow them to persist and then cause a liability.
Well, what would an
Um,
adjuster be looking for? Would they be looking for those suckers that come up that shows that the tree is in some kind of danger or something to that effect? What would they be looking for?
An adjuster is going to be looking for dead trees and a history of failure. So if you're looking at dead trees, dead branches, and there's been repeated failures over time, those are the kinds of things that you look at and say, wow, you really need to get on this.
Now, Marty, you had said that property owners have a duty. Are you aware of any statutes that require inspections as a matter of law, like a statute that says, you must, have an arborist take a look at your property or anything like that?
Yeah, none of this is statutory. All of it is common law. And this goes all the way back to, Blackwood and Old English law in England. And so none of this is statutory. There's not a requirement, a statutory requirement. There's just this liability that hangs out there that if you're going to be a good steward of your trees, and you get a lot of people around a lot of big trees, then you have to do your diligence and you have to be dutiful to get out there and look at them and identify those things that are hazardous, particularly dead trees and dead branches. And then you have to mitigate them within a reasonable period of time. And it's good to have a policy in place that spells all that out and has the procedures and the processes to get that done.
So for a business, it's a good idea to have kind of a risk management program that includes a section on trees.
Yes, any tree owner that has large numbers, especially of big old trees, in proximity to people, near people, should have a tree risk management policy that covers all of the contingencies, how frequently you need to inspect the trees, what you're identifying, how you communicate that to the stakeholders, how you the process of mitigating those tree risks when they're identified, and then some follow-up quality controls to help make sure the policy is working and that it's working well, and if there's ways to improve it.
On a simpler level, what about homeowners? Do they have a similar duty?
I was
All
just
tree,
going to ask that.
go ahead, go ahead,
Well, can I?
go ahead.
Because I was just going to throw a curveball to Marty and say, hey, we're talking risk management, and 9 times out of 10, when I see a tree claim, it comes through on a homeowner, and I'm thinking about this particular street in Kansas City, Overland Park area, where we've got these beautiful, beautiful trees, big old trees, and they've got these massive branches that are going over the road. And I just look at them, being the adjuster that I am, saying, oh my goodness gracious, that city kind of needs to cut that limb because that is huge. And if that tree limb were to fall on a car, it would be bad. And I mean, it's a major thoroughfare as well. And so it bleeds over into what Bill had asked, what should a homeowner do if it's obviously the homeowner's tree, but when it crosses over into city property, it becomes the city's responsibility, as I understand it. What should the city do, or what risk management should the owner do, or something like that, so that this tree branch doesn't break off one day and hurt a civilian because the city hasn't done something?
Well, I should probably jump in here and preface anything that I say is not legal advice, and I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on podcasts or anywhere else. I'm just speaking from the perspective of an expert who works in these circles and works on a lot of legal cases involving trees. So don't take anything that I say as legal advice. If you need an attorney, go get an attorney, but that's not me. So yeah, it's a good question because all tree owners have the same duty. They have to inspect their trees periodically, and they have to identify anything that looks dangerous. And, to the court, basically what that means is, if the average person would look at it and say that looks dangerous, that's a dangerous looking tree. You know it when you see it, right? So, but yeah, they have the duty, and if they fail to exercise that duty of care, then they can be held liable for any damage or injuries that occur as a result of a tree failure. If you have doubts that you don't know if it looks dangerous or not, you can always call in an expert and have a tree risk assessment.
So why don't you tell me about what a risk assessment is and how an inspection of a tree is actually conducted and what that means?
Okay, so tree risk assessment falls under the ANSI A300 Part 9. And this is a consensus standard that was developed by the tree care industry. And essentially, with tree risk assessment, it's just a small sliver of the larger picture of tree risk management. So, tree risk assessment is just one of those elements of the tree risk management policy. And when we do tree risk assessments, we're talking about three different levels of inspection. So the first level is level one. That's where we're driving in a vehicle or maybe walking down a roadway, and we're looking at the canopy of a tree from one side, and we're looking for obvious dangers. Typically, that's the dead tree or the dead branch that's hanging over a roadway or a sidewalk and could potentially fall on people or property. And so we're assessing these things. When we find those, we're identifying the location, and then we're making recommendations on what to do about that particular issue. Normally, we're not focused on much more detail than that. So it's a pretty quick and dirty corridor type of treatment where we're just looking at both sides of the corridor and we're trying to identify really obvious stuff. The next level would be a level two. This is an on the ground, touching the tree type of evaluation where we're walking 360 degrees around the tree and we're looking at all parts of the tree from the ground to look for serious defects, and we're looking for obvious hazards. And of course, the same procedures follow. We identify those, we do the risk analysis, and then we make our recommendations to mitigate those risks. Then if we get a tree that is, it looks like it could possibly be dangerous, but we've done our level two and we really weren't able to find anything conclusive that says, yes, this tree's got to go, or no, it's got to stay, it could stay. It's a much more invasive type of analysis where we take specialized equipment and specialized analysis. And it's fairly expensive to do these types of analysis. But we're actually going into the tree to find out how much decay is in the hollow part of the trunk, or we're checking the strength of the crotch to make sure that it's going to hold upright. But generally speaking, trees that don't have defects are not dangerous. And so a tree that doesn't have obvious defects, you're not going to do more analysis on it. But a tree that has defects, depending on how important the tree is and how much risk is involved, might require a level three. Those are fairly infrequent. I do maybe 3 or 4 a year for the level three risk assessment, but other assessments are much more frequent.
So the level three is more the most detailed that you've described here, but it's also the most expensive. So when does a property owner know when they need a 1, 2, or a 3 level inspection?
Well, every tree owner needs a level one. I mean, every tree owner that has trees in proximity to people, even if they just go out and look for themselves and look for dangerous dead branches, dead trees, everybody who owns trees in proximity to people has to do that. That's part of their duty. And then if they find something, of course, they mitigate that in a reasonable period of time. Level two is more for municipalities and golf courses and campgrounds, theme parks, anybody that has large numbers of people near large trees and high frequency of occupancy. Those are good candidates for a level two. And in a level two assessment, you're pretty much looking at every tree in detail. In real high occupied areas, you're probably going to do that once a year. For less occupied, less frequency, you're going to do that maybe once every 3 years. And for low frequency occupancy, you're going to be doing it maybe once every 5 years. So there are gradients of frequency of intensity for inspections depending on the risk. Bigger, older trees are going to fail more frequently than younger, smaller trees. And so in areas where you have lots of people and big old trees, where you're going to be inspecting those much more frequently.
Well, what kind of maintenance should we do on trees besides, I guess, pruning them up or just looking at them or maybe fertilizing them? I mean, I got to tell you, I'm so happy to be speaking with you today. I have maybe a brown thumb. I can grow weeds. I can sometimes keep a fern alive. It depends. My ferns are a little stressed right now because I just brought them in for the winter, so they're not really happy. So how do we keep our trees alive?
Well, trees want to live. And so, generally speaking, if they've been planted well and they've been selected well for the site conditions, then they want to grow and they're going to thrive on their own. Um, Occasionally, trees get insects or disease and they need a little help to overcome those urban stresses that they wouldn't have out in nature. And so, again, having a tree expert on call to come in and take a look at your trees periodically, that's not a bad idea. Because tree people will see things that the homeowner, now you do have to be a little bit careful on who you have come out and look at your trees, because there's a lot of tree folks out there that make a living selling tree work, tree
Right.
services. And so it's sometimes a challenge to sift out, are they just trying to sell me something here? or is this something that I really need? And to get that, you have to have somebody like me who does consulting work and doesn't have a dog in it. I'm not there to sell anybody anything. I'm just there to provide information where a homeowner can make a good decision.
Well, that brings up a very good point. You had mentioned some tree disease, and I know that here where I live in Overland Park, Kansas, we have a couple of tree species that are susceptible. And I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas, where they just planted Bradford pear trees all the time, and I'm not a big fan, but that's neither here nor there. But they tend to be, I guess, very weak. Is there like a website for an adjuster to go to who would go, okay, so the insured had a tree fall or a branch fall. I need to know if this is a particular type of tree that has a susceptibility to an insect thing.
So if you're just looking for some local arborist to come and give you advice, you can go to the International Society of Arboriculture website, and they have a Find an Arborist location finder, and you can put in your zip code, and they'll help you find a local arborist to come and look at your tree. For liability stuff where something's already happened, you really need to get somebody who is highly skilled at that. There's maybe a half a dozen of us in the United States that do uh, litigation tree work consulting for a living, and so there's really not that many of us around.
It's a niche thing.
It
It's
is
very
a very
cool.
niche thing. Excuse me. But the American Society of Consulting Arborists has more of them than anybody else. And so they also have a Find a Consulting Arborist website.
Well,
Sorry.
you had mentioned golf courses, municipalities and campgrounds, and these areas that have a lot of trees.
Mhm.
It would become, I would presume, cost prohibitive to inspect all the trees that may be on a particular property. I'm looking at a local park across the road from my office here, and it's a forest. And I walk through that forest quite a bit. I was there yesterday, and there was trees, dead trees laying everywhere. I guess there is a some common sense that property owners would need to use and select the trees that are most likely to cause a problem rather than the trees that are pretty far off the path or anything like that. So when you're trying to decide which trees to inspect and which to not inspect, what should a property owner be considering?
So one of the elements of a tree risk management policy is defining the geographic area that you're going to be focused on. And of course, these are areas where the highest numbers of people are being directed to travel in that particular area. So the highest, uh, where you have the highest traffic and the largest trees, these are going to be your hot red zones. And these are the ones that you're going to want to inspect every year. As you get further away from these main arteries of travel, then you're going to be getting out into the yellow zone. And then when you get further on beyond that, where the people just don't frequent and are not directed to go, that's going to be the green zone. And of course, in areas of tracts of land where you have trees out in the wilderness that nobody's ever expected to travel, you don't have to inspect those at all. And so you have these different zones of intensity that you want to focus your efforts on, and that's fairly inexpensive. I mean, when you talk about municipalities, for example, in Atlanta, um, they are required to travel every single roadway that has street trees and look at every single tree and identify any hazardous conditions that exist on those roadways once every couple of years. And so if they can do it, then an owner of a smaller amount of property can also do it. And it's not expensive when you consider what the liabilities might be for failing to do so. I mean, many of these cases get into the millions of dollars. And so when you're talking the potential liability of millions versus spending, 10 or 20 or $30,000 to inspect your trees, well, inspecting the trees is a lot cheaper. Because
Yeah,
eventually people will have incidents and trees will fall on people if they're not managed properly.
because that brings up a very good question or thought process about the cost implications of, looking at a tree, doing a tree inspection versus having that bodily injury or that property damage where the tree falls through a house or onto a car or something to that effect. And I would also think that if you are in an area where there is more tendency for trees to fall, let's say from hurricanes or big force winds or something to that effect, there's more of a duty or a standard of care for the homeowner or the property owner to look at that tree.
So that's a really good point. That's the difference between an act of God and a failure to meet your duty.
Mm.
Is there are wind conditions that are unforeseeable and are beyond normal. And when we get to those wind conditions, and it does depend on what part of the country you're in, it depends on what the average, high wind frequency is in your particular part of the world. Um, but there are some circumstances where wind was the cause, and there was no foreseeability of it. Whereas oftentimes, though, in virtually almost every case that I worked on, wind has been a factor. And is it a wind that would have caused some unusual circumstance? Would 70-mile-an-hour winds are pretty much all bets are off. But if you are talking about a 30 or 35 or 40-mile-an-hour wind, that's a foreseeable event, and we should be taking actions to prevent failures in those kinds of winds, especially when we're talking about tree defects.
I have a question that talks a little bit about shared liability. And when we have liability cases, we always look to the actions of the plaintiff or the claimant to see if they did anything that had contributed to their own, injury. And in a case where you've got trees, and you've mentioned the red zones and the yellow zone, and then the area out of the yellow zone. I don't know if you gave that a color or not, but um, if you have, let's say, a park and there are trails, and then you have red zones along those trails, and then you've got yellow zones outside of that. And then you've got a nincompoop like me who likes to wander off the trail and just go wherever he wants to. Do you get in a situation then where that person has assumed some liability by wandering into areas that maybe were off the beaten path?
Yeah, so the big directive for tree liability is that if you have created a path, if you have directed people to move in a certain way, that's on the tree owner. But if the poor individual goes off the path and there's some dead stuff out there and they just happen to walk underneath a tree and the deadfall falls on them, well, that's not really directed, is it? I mean, that's self-directed. And so there is that, of course, the courts will decide on these things. And, that's a decision for a jury and a court to make. But the liability there is going to be more on the individual walking out in the middle of the woods where nobody expected him to go. There's no duty there to protect that individual because it's not something that you would expect and anticipate that it would be foreseeable that they would wander off into this dead zone and just not as much liability there.
Yeah, I do think that that would be more of an assumption of risk or an assumption of liability
Yeah, yeah, for
on
sure.
on the part of the wanderer. But I can understand also the attractiveness of kind of getting off the beaten path.
And I'm like you, Bill. I do it all the time. When I go out west and I'm just out there in the wilderness, I like to wander. And
Yeah,
I'm taking my risk when I see deadfall out there and I'm walking around these deadfall trees.
yeah.
That's on me. I
Usually, if I'm in the woods with my camera and I see a bird, I'm chasing that thing to see if I can get a good shot. And I look around, then I'm like, where am I now?
there you go.
So, well, tell me a little bit about becoming, or not becoming, but being an expert witness and what sets a credible expert witness apart from somebody who may know a lot about trees, but isn't really equipped to function as a subject matter expert in the context of a liability claim.
So you know, there's a lot of arborists out there in the world that would love to be able to do what I do for a living because it's a pretty good gig. And I have to admit, I do like doing what I do for a living. It's very rewarding in a lot of ways, and just being able to help people inform decisions that important decisions that people are making. I enjoy that part of it. Um, but there's a few ingredients that you just have to have in order to do it well. And not everybody has what it takes. So it's really not for everybody. There's a lot of pitfalls and things that can easily go awry. You have to be good at a lot of different things. And it really helps to be curious. And it really does help to be a bit of a nerd about things. But the main ingredients are the same types of ingredients that you would expect from any other professional. You want your expert to be independent. You want them to have objectivity. You want them to be impartial. They've got to be an excellent communicator. You want them to have a high degree of integrity and competence in what they do. And then they need to be able to keep everything confidential so that they don't injure their clients. And those are the main ingredients that I think really make up a good consulting arborist.
What kind of claims do you normally see as an arborist or an expert witness?
Well, I've covered a huge range of different types of cases, everything from eminent domain to trespass cases. Trespass is probably one I'm well known for since I wrote the book on the value of amenity trees. And then I get my fair share of personal injury cases. Some of the biggest personal injury tree cases in the country have come across my desk.
The eminent domain thing is interesting. We have seen actually quite a number of claims here where someone is cutting down someone else's trees by mistake, and sometimes intentionally, but most times it's because they don't know where the property line is or something like that. And those can be interesting cases. And valuing the trees that are taken down seems to be the biggest challenge.
Do you have a way to do that, Marty? Because I back Bill up in this because again, coming from Arkansas, paper mills are big, and so there's these huge swaths of land where we have these trees, and the loggers will accidentally, not intentionally, but accidentally cut down some land or some trees that belong to someone else. So, is there a way to value trees?
Well, sure. I mean, that's a big part of what I do. So there's a lot of ways to skin the appraisal value cat. Um, so depending on the intended use of the land, the size, the species, the location, and the condition of the trees, the actual utility of those trees goes a long way towards determining what type and definition of value we use to appraise the value of a tree. So if you are a logger and you cross the boundary and you get into somebody's backyard where they can enjoy the trees as amenities, as aesthetic, functional parts of their land. And they have intended use that says this was going to be screening and it was going to be fall color and was going to do all these other different, provide all these other different benefits. Then you can get amenity value for those trees. And amenity value is going to be far greater than the value of, say, wood fiber. When we are talking about wood fiber, we're talking about pennies on the dollar. We're talking about, basically dirt value. And when we're talking about amenity value, we're talking about putting back what was lost. And so if we've lost a 20, 30, 40-inch oak tree, then what would it take to put a 10, 20, or 30-inch oak tree back in that location? And so the value can really depend on the intended use of the land and often does.
I think it would be easier to calculate the value of pulpwood, for example, because there's probably a number per tree that these paper companies pay for a certain amount of pulpwood versus the canopy tree that's beautiful in the backyard and adds some sort of value to the property from a real estate standpoint.
Sure, there's a big difference between tons of wood pulp
Hmm.
and
One claim we had they actually valued all the logs based on the lumber that would come from them. They were all
correct.
hardwoods, so
And some sort of product that you could make out of the wood
yeah.
fiber. And that's just one type of value. And if that's the intended use of the land, then that's an appropriate type of valuation. But if the intended use of the land is to be able to have your grandkids enjoy a picnic underneath the living canopy of the tree, well, that's a different type of value altogether.
Yeah, I think that's hard because where I see it mostly in Arkansas is, of course, out in the woods and there's nobody around. It's not like it's the backyard, it's like the back 40 kind of deal. And it
Right.
just happens to be your large tract of land that your family has always owned. And so that's where I've seen some of the wood or the tree claims that have come in from the loggers getting on inadvertently onto your land.
Well, let's change it up a little bit. Let's say that the intended use of the land isn't for aesthetic purposes. Let's say the intended use of the land was for conservation, and we want this wildlife habitat preserved for future generations. Well, what do you do then? Is it wood fiber? Is it amenity? And it turns out that conservation value is the same thing as amenity value.
Okay. See, that's kind of where my knee-jerk reaction went. So I'm kind of glad that you said that because I'm thinking, I know that these guys, my cousins, for example, have these big tracts of land that they go hunting on. And, that's so it's an amenity to them. Uh,
Correct.
and
And
that was
that's
my
one type of
knee-jerk reaction.
conservation. It's, if you just want to have wildlife habitat to be able to enjoy watching birds like Bill does, or if you like to hunt or any number of other conservation uses. And, there is a problem where the white oak trees are disappearing. And so there are conservation easements now that are in place simply to preserve and grow white oak trees.
It's interesting that the amenity value and the value for conservation are the same because both of them just contemplate that you have to now put them back if they're removed.
They contemplate a live tree performing some sort of benefit, providing
Yeah.
some sort of benefit. Yeah.
And if you've got a 50 or a 60-year-old oak tree, you can't just plant another one that's 50 or 60 years old. So, from a practical standpoint, how do you resolve that problem?
Well, is that a true statement? Is that a fact? Or is that just some perceived idea? Because
It's a perceived
transplanting a
idea from
tree.
this end.
So let me just clarify that. There is no tree that's too big to move. There,
Really?
there are
Okay,
limits.
so that's news to me. I mean, honestly,
Yeah,
because I'm thinking of the
physiologically,
root ball. I'm thinking,
physiologically, you can do it. You can do it. Now, is it something that you could do without destroying the highway? That's a different question. So if you're moving it over the road, yeah, it might be a little more difficult. There is a upper limit of about 18 inches that you can move over the highway. But as far as, from one part of a site to another part of the site, yeah, you could do it.
Interesting. So, in worst case scenario, let's say you've got a 120-foot hardwood tree of some sort, and that falls
Mhm.
down, and you say, well, you're going to have to pay to put a new one there, a replacement 120-foot tree. You got to go out in the woods somewhere and find one, get it out of the ground, and bring it over here,
If
and
it
that's going to
falls down,
cost.
I would say no.
What's that?
If it falls down, I would say no. But if it's cut down, that's a different animal
If it's cut down.
by trespass or some other illegal activity,
Okay. All right. Well, if it's cut down and you demand a replacement of it,
right?
they got to figure out a way to get another tree in there and what that will cost.
Right.
And that could be
So we've
like,
we've actually come up with some really neat techniques to do that in the arboricultural world. Um, Back in 2000, the Council for Tree and Landscape Appraiser came out with something called the trunk formula method. And this was a method by which we take a smaller nursery tree, size tree, and we calculate the cross-sectional area of that tree. And we calculate the cost to harvest, transport, and transplant that tree into the subject site. And then we scale that up to the subject size tree. And then we depreciate for species, location, and condition. And that way we can have a benefits equivalency for a new tree.
okay, that's what I'm looking for.
All right.
Something solid that you can use a little science, a little
It's very, very
practicality.
credible. It's very, very credible because basically it replaces the benefits that were lost on an equivalency scale.
Interesting. So you don't actually have to move that big tree. You can figure out the cost of it and put a smaller tree in.
Yeah, and if we were to do that in practicality, that's basically the formula that we would use.
Interesting. Okay, cool. I knew I'd learn something from this conversation.
I've learned a lot,
Yeah.
mostly because we do run into these kind of tree claims. I don't think any of mine have ever gone into litigation, but I can see how it would. Most of my tree claims are property damage, though. Even though it's liability, it's property damage. Like, the tree quote unquote got stolen because the loggers accidentally cut it down, or it fell on the house. But it can actually hurt a person. So.
Happens
But it,
all the time, and it happens much more frequently than you might think. Just to kind of give you an idea, about the same number of people each year get struck by lightning as get struck by a tree or tree part. The chances
Interesting.
are, if you get struck by lightning, you're going to live.
Mm,
60% chance you're going to survive. But not so with trees. With trees or tree parts, if you get struck by a tree or tree part, 60% chance you're not going to make it. And the big difference between lightning strikes, of course, and trees is that a lot of tree failures are preventable.
Interesting. Well, when we're talking about the amenity issue, I'm going to swing back to that for a second because it reminds me of a news story about someone who owned this mansion and there was a view of a lake or a mountain that they wanted to see. So they cut the swath of trees through the forest so that they could see this view. And it turns out that they cut down a bunch of trees that somebody else owned, and there was a big lawsuit over that.
Right.
Um, and it just
You
reminds
think that would be amenity value or timber value?
Um, I guess it depends on the guy who owned the trees and what he was using them for. Um, but that from an insurance standpoint, that sounds a lot like an intentional act,
Yeah,
which may not be covered, assuming he knew they weren't his trees. But
right. But
anyway,
anyway, hey, Marty, we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I know you, Bill had said you'd written a book. So how can people get that book? What are you going to be doing? How can people find you, contact
Sure.
you, and stuff like that?
So the name of my book is the Professional Amenity Plant Appraisal Handbook. You can go to PROAPAH.com and you can purchase the book online. If you need to get a hold of me, I'm Marty Shaw, and just look up Marty Shaw Expert Witness for trees or tree-related matter, and you'll come to my webpage, greenseasonconsulting.com. And should I give my phone number out?
if you'd like, we'll put all your
Yeah, we can put that
information
in the show
in the show
notes.
notes
Sure.
for
I-
sure.
I'll put the link of your book in the show notes as well.
And yeah, so if you do have a tree case and you got a sticky situation that they're suing you for millions of dollars or what have you, then I'm definitely the guy you want to talk to.
Great. And also, if we want to value a tree, would that be something you could help with?
Yeah, tree appraisal is one of those common areas of contention and litigation. And if you just need an appraisal, I can do just the appraisal. It does require me to do a site visit, and depending on where you are in the country, it might be cost effective to have me do that. But amenity trees are worth quite a bit more than timber trees and wood fiber trees. And so if you've enjoyed those trees and they're gone and you want them back the way they were, that's where I come in.
Got it. Very good.
If you
Well,
had one piece of advice for property owners regarding trees and liability, what would that be?
Do your duty, exercise due diligence, and just realize that you have a duty of care, that you owe a duty to those who might be injured or have damage caused by your trees, and so you do have to look at them. And if you are unsure or you don't really know what to do, bring in an expert. It's a lot cheaper than having to face a liability.
pay attention to your trees, people.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It's a
Yeah.
good idea.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, very good. Well, it sounds like that about wraps things up, Chantel.
It does. It does.
All right. Well, thanks
Oh,
again for coming, Marty. It's always, a pleasure to talk to you, and we sure did learn a lot today. So
absolutely. Like we
thanks
can
for
move
coming
trees.
on. Yeah, yeah,
It's been great to be here with you, and we'll have plenty more to talk about next time.
Yeah.
yeah. Well,
Thank
great. Well,
you.
happy holidays to everybody, and we'll sign off here.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us on the Art of Adjusting podcast, where we talk about life as an insurance adjuster.
If you enjoyed this podcast or this episode, please give us 5 stars and a review. It does help the algorithm pick us up.
Hit that subscribe button real quick and tell all of your adjuster friends to check this out as well. For independent adjusting services, go to www.auten.claims. And for anyone interested in working as an independent liability adjuster, go to the Contact Us tab to join our roster.
In the meantime, you can contact me at theartofadjusting.com for consulting and training purposes.